Hello everyone, welcome to another part in this Dungeon Mechanics tutorial series. Today we're going to take a look at how to damage the player when the enemy animation has reached a certain point in its animation path. We're going to be using Anim Notify States and also the damage collisions to get this done. Let's go ahead and get started. First, let's go to our content drawer and then open up our enemy blueprint. In the enemy blueprint, what we want to do is we want to add a bit of a trigger, a collision box right on these blades. And then when that collision box touches the player during the animation, we're going to go ahead and do the damage to the player. To do that, I'm going to select the mesh and then add in a box collision. You can choose to play with this collision and then make it as big or small as you would like. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm just going to make a simple box collision and then name it damage trigger. Now this damage trigger, immediately it's going to be at the bottom, and I want this to actually move along with this melee weapon. So over here on the right side where you see parent socket, you can actually choose a socket and attach it to it. Now if you select the actual mesh and go over to the skeletal mesh, you can go through different sockets and then see which one would fit best for your character. If not, you could always select one of the sockets. For example, I can select this right hand socket. I can right click on it and I can add a new socket and then name that as a melee weapon trigger. Just like this, I've created a melee trigger socket, and you can then position your socket where you want it, and then you can attach your damage trigger to that socket. One other option that you can do is to use an existing socket. So I'm going to use this muzzle O2. It's actually comes with the character, and I'm going to just use that as well. And again, you can choose to use your own socket. So I'm going to select the damage trigger. On this parent socket, I'm going to search for muzzle O2. And now you will notice the box is actually moving along with the weapon and the animation. That's because it's attached. Now the core of the box is now attached to the axe or muzzle O2 socket. So it's going to move along with that socket, which is good. So now we just need to go ahead and update this box so it sits right on top of this actual blade. All right, so we have set up I have set up my socket or the damage trigger on this muzzle tool socket, and I've also made it size small so that it would actually fill up this entire blade. And if I would like, I could always make it shrink this a little bit more as well, so it's nice and it's in a specific spot. And I think this would do the trick for the purpose of this. And again, in your game, feel free to, tweak it as much as you'd like to find a perfect spot for you. But for the purpose of this tutorial, this actually should do. It's right above the blade and it's hitting it over here. It should still be good enough to do the trigger check. Now we want to do the damage to the player every time this enemy AI swings and hits the player. This actual damage trigger hits the player. So we're going to right click on this damage trigger and say add event and open on component begin overlap. We want to drag this other actor and check to see if this is the player actor. We're going to say equal and say get player actor. Player character. And we're going to do a boolean, a branch, and we're going to check if this is the player actor. And off of this, we're going to say apply damage. And what this does is it's going to go ahead and apply a static damage onto the player. And the damaged actor would be our player character. So I'm just going to drag this and then attach it here. So that will be our player character that's being attached. And the base damage, I want the enemy to do like 5 damage. And in my player stat system, I've made it so that the negative numbers is to reduce the health and the positive numbers is to increase the health. So that's why I made it as -5. But in your game, however you set up your apply damage, you would change this number. And the damage causer, we're just going to leave it at self. Now we need to do this event in our player as well, so the player is able to actually take damage. So back in our third person blueprint, down here, I'm going to go right click and say event any damage. And again, this function comes with the engine, so it's not something that I created. It actually comes with the engine. I'm going to drag this BPC player stats, and I'm going to say update player stats. And here, I'm going to drag this. It is going to be our health that's going to be impacted. The damage is going to be to our base increment. And everything else, we don't really care about it at this time. Now, if I go and press play, you will see what would happen. So the enemy would come, attack me, and I don't know if you can see it, but the enemy is attacking twice in every single swing. Let me show you much more clearer. So here, every time it triggers, I'm going to do a print string and say attack. Past tense. I'm going to say attack, right? So now if I compile, and if you see on the top, every time the enemy attack, you'll see 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's because the trigger that we have applied, when the swing happens, it's going to trigger, and when the enemy is swinging the axe back to its normal position, it's going to trigger again. We only want it to trigger once. And again, if you, in your game, if you want to have the character, take 2 damage, that's perfectly fine. But we're going to go a little bit advanced here and set up some Anim notifications to make it so that the enemy only hits us on the way down, not on the way up. To do that, we're going to first go ahead and go to our dungeon mechanics and go to our BPI dungeon interface. We're going to use the interface to notify if the that trigger should be activated. This trigger, if it should be active or not active. So we're going to use our dungeon manager to handle that. So here I'm going to go anim _ enable trigger collision. And the second one, I'm going to name it as anim _ disable trigger collision. And in our enemy base, in our interface, these are the 2 events that we just created. So I'm going to right click and implement both of these events. I'm going to drag this damage trigger. And for enable, I'm going to say set collision enabled. And I will make this of type query only. And I'm going to copy and paste this here and set the target as our damage trigger. And then here I'm going to say no collision. So when the interface message saying disable the trigger, it's going to say no collision. And when the interface message says set collision, then it's going to go and say query only. So this is how we're going to enable and disable the triggers. We need a way to call this animation, these 2 interface functions from the animation when the enemy is swinging the axe. So to do that, we're going to go to our character animation folder where we created our montage, and we're going to create a new Anim Notify. Go into your blueprint class and then search for Anim Notify State and select. So what this Anim Notify State is, this is a notification trigger that actually is enabled for a certain amount of time, and it can call out functions when it enables, and it can disable or call out different functions when it's completed. So here I'm going to name this BP _ enable collision. And inside of this, it doesn't look like in any of your regular blueprint. There's no event graph or anything. But in our functions, there's actually an override function. We're going to go and say received notify begin, and also another one for received notify end. In our received notify begin, all we have to do is get our mesh component and get our owner. This would be the enemy AI, because this is notify is going to be on the actual animation. So this is going to go and get the owner of the mesh component that the animation is running on. And the owner would be the enemy AI. And off of this, I am going to go ahead and call in anim enable trigger. I'm going to go ahead to the receive notify end, do the exact same thing, mesh component, get the owner of the mesh component, and then say anim disable trigger collision. And now we can go ahead, compile, and save. So right now in our enemy base, we already have this event, and we have our notify calling out this event. Now we just need to put these notifies into the animation. Let's go ahead and close this. We don't need the interface for now. And I'm going to go to our content drawer, and we have 6 different melee attacks. Now, if you have a single melee attack, this will be easy, but if it is 6, you have to do for every single one of them. So what you need to do is open up your melee attack, and then slow it down on the top over here. If you just click and drag, you should be able to slow it down frame by frame. I'm going to go and take a look at where exactly I want that trigger to be enabled. So right about when the enemy is about to attack the player, about the height of the player, I'm going to, on this track number 1, I'm going to right click and say add notify state. And then there's the BP that we just created and say enable that BP, enable a collision. And I'm going to continue dragging and I'm going to see where it goes past the player. So this is about past the player. And I'm going to extend this BP enable collision. So what this does is that at this point of the frame, it's going to call out the notification to enable the trigger. And this is our receive notify begin. And then this is our receive notify end, where it's going to call out the notification to disable the trigger. Now I'm going to go ahead and do this for all the other montages. Okay, so I have added the enable collision notify state to all 6 of these Anim montages. What this will do is when the animation is going to play, this Anim notify state is going to trigger the receive and also the begin and the end and call out these interfaces. So now if I were to go press play and then bring in an enemy, you notice when it attacks, my health only goes down the single time, not when it returns, only when it goes forward. And this is how simple it is to actually make the enemy attack the player and reduce the health. Folks, thank you again for joining in another tutorial series. I really do appreciate you coming this far in this tutorial series. If this series is helping you out, please hit that like button and also subscribe, because this will allow the channel to grow and reach out to many more developers just like you. And you can always feel free to use the comment section to make any requests with me. Once again, thank you for joining, and I'll see you in the next part where we're going to do the player death event. Have fun game developing. Thank you, Merle Peterson, for joining the Patreon and supporting this channel to grow.